Imagine watching a 24-year-old so invisible that people forgot she existed, suddenly rise in the middle of a $200 million corporate meltdown and speak just one sentence. A sentence that would not only save the company but build a bridge between two nations on the brink of walking away from each other. She had no MBA, no flashy resume, she'd never even been on a plane. But the next day, Chinese executives refused to continue business unless she flew to Shanghai because they saw in her something most of the board had overlooked: respect, courage, and truth. What gave her the confidence to speak? It wasn't a business mentor or a seminar. It was something far deeper, the silent language she learned each night, just to speak to the one person who always listened, her deaf grandmother. If you believe the smallest voices can make the loudest impact, stay with this story. 7:29 a.m. The city of Seattle is still shaking off its morning mist. Glass towers pierce low-hanging clouds. The hum of distant traffic rises like breath through the cold. Inside one of those towers, on the 15th floor, the fluorescent lights flicker on. Ivy Carter slips through the revolving doors of Skybridge Logistics like a soft breeze. No one greets her, no one notices. She's exactly on time again. She likes it that way. She moves down the hallway with quiet grace, her shoes silent against the marble. Her cubicle is tucked away near the copy machines where no one important lingers, but today, like every day, a folded note sits on her desk. Blue ink, crisp edges, 3 words: today will shine. Gigabyte, she smiles softly, fingers brushing over the initials. GB George Bennett, the man in the basement archives, the only person who remembers her name. She tucks the note into her purse, where it joins dozens of others. Her personal treasury of hope. Ivy is no ordinary intern, but nobody at Skybridge knows that. They see her as the quiet one, the one who nods too much, who eats lunch alone, who wears sweaters even in June. But while others scroll through social media during meetings, Ivy listens, watches, learns, and, above all, remembers. She remembers the little mistakes, the missing numbers, the subtle tension when the translation slides appear on the projector during Asia-Pacific meetings. They don't know. Ivy speaks fluent Mandarin. They don't know she spent 5 years caring for her grandmother, who was deaf. That's where she learned to listen not just with her ears, but with her soul. Her nights weren't filled with parties or Netflix binges. They were filled with Chinese grammar books, YouTube sign language lessons, and quietly whispering vocab to the stars from a cold apartment balcony. Down in the archives, George Bennett sips lukewarm coffee. 66 years old, widower, archivist, forgotten by most but not by Ivy, and definitely not forgetting Ivy. He watches the company fall into chaos above him. Late deliveries, failed deals, boardroom whispers, but something about the girl upstairs keeps him grounded. She reminds him of his daughter. Sarah was born deaf, brilliant, kind. She died 7 years ago, in a car crash on her way to a teaching interview. The world forgot. George didn single quotes. Each morning, placing that folded note on Ivy's desk is his ritual, a thread to his past, a belief in the future. She doesn't know who writes them. She just knows they make her feel seen. It happens at 10 a.m. The boardroom is packed. Ivy is there only to operate the presentation slides for Mr. Hargrove, the director of global markets. She wears a navy cardigan, blending into the wall. The Chinese investors on the other side of the table look uncomfortable. Something is wrong. The translated slide reads, "We will reduce support and remove non-vital partners." Ivy's eyes narrowed. She read the original Mandarin email. It said, "We will refocus, support, and collaborate more efficiently with partners." Not the same, not even close. She shifts in her chair. Her hands tremble. This deal is worth $200 million. Saying something would be career suicide, but staying silent. She hears her grandmother's voice. Not in words, but in memory. Do not fear the echo when you speak the truth. Everyone is talking, arguing. Ivy rises. A hush falls. Her voice is barely above a whisper. "Excuse me. The translation on slide 6 is incorrect. Double quotes. Silence. Mr. Hargrove turns crimson. "Excuse me, Miss Carter?" She swallows. The original Mandarin states a desire to strengthen partnerships, not cut them. The translation could be perceived as hostile. The Chinese delegation sits forward. One of the executives asks a question in Mandarin, without hesitation. Ivy responds. Her accent is careful, respectful, perfect. And in that moment the room shifts. 2 hours later, the meeting ends. Ivy returns to her cubicle, heart racing. She thinks she's about to be fired. Instead, George appears. He places a new note on her desk, his hands shaking. "You did it. You saw the storm and stood still." GB. An hour after that, Mr. Hargrove knocks on her cubicle wall. He looks pale. "The Chinese team has requested you join them in Shanghai." "Personally?" Ivy stares at him. "What?" "They say they won't proceed unless you attend." The car is waiting. Her knees buckle. She's never been on a plane. In the car, she clutches her grandmother's old bracelet. Her phone buzzes. A message from George. "World, only sees what makes noise, but real change begins in silence. Have you ever watched someone step onto a plane not just to fly, but to finally rise into who they were always meant to be? That's what it looked like as Ivy Carter boarded that early morning flight. Her oversized cardigan tugged tightly around, her small frame, eyes wide with wonder, heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out the engines. She sat near the window, fingertips brushing the foggy glass, staring out at the Seattle skyline as it faded beneath the clouds. She'd never left her city, never slept in a hotel, never imagined her name would be printed on a first-class boarding pass with words like international delegate beside it. Yet here she was. She clutched a brown, leather notebook to her chest, the same one she used to scribble Chinese characters and late at night beside her grandmother's hospital bed. Inside were memories and meanings, symbols and phrases that had become lifelines between two generations who never shared the same spoken language, but always shared love. The man seated beside her, Mr. Liu, one of the Chinese executives from the boardroom, turned to her with a kind smile. "You learned our language very well," he said gently, "but you didn't just translate. You understood. You respected the meaning." Ivy nodded shyly. She didn't know what to say. "You honored us," he added, after a moment. "And in our culture, honor is remembered, even in silence." The words stayed with her long after the plane lifted into the sky. As the clouds gave way to stars, she thought about her grandmother, the one who had taught her how to speak without words, how to listen without judgment, and how to see people, not as labels or roles but as stories unfolding, sentence by sentence. She landed in Shanghai just before sunrise. The air smelled like rain and jasmine. It was as though the city itself had been waiting for her. A black car waited at the curb. A woman in a sleek navy uniform greeted her by name, bowing politely before taking her suitcase. They drove through quiet streets lined with lanterns and flowering trees, passing skyscrapers so tall they seemed to slice the sky. Ivy had never seen anything like it. At the hotel, she was ushered into a suite so beautiful she almost couldn't breathe. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glittering river outside, boats slicing through the still water like brushstrokes on a painting. On the bed, there was a robe, fresh tea, and another note, this one in Mandarin. It read, "The one who speaks truth in gentleness changes more hearts than the one who shouts with pride." Tears stung her eyes. For the first time, she felt what she had only imagined before, that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible anymore. But the meeting wasn't going to be easy, because what no one had told her was that the Chinese firm wasn't just nervous about the translation. They were preparing to walk away from the entire partnership. What Ivy had saved in that boardroom had only bought time. Now, they wanted to speak directly to the one person they felt actually heard them. Turn inside the conference room. High above Shanghai's skyline, Ivy sat at the polished table across from 5 executives in tailored suits. There was no translator, no script, just expectation. One of them leaned forward. "Miss Carter, we were not expecting you to understand more than words. But you did. May I ask why? Did you care enough to correct the translation?" Ivy looked down for a moment. Then she lifted her eyes. "Because I know what it feels like," she said softly, "to be misinterpreted, to say something simple, and have people twist it until it means something cold. My grandmother was deaf. The world misunderstood her, all the time. So, I learned how to listen carefully." The room fell still. She continued, voice steadying with every word. "I've learned that language is more than words. It's respect. And when we don't respect meaning, we lose connection. And when we lose connection, we lose everything." One of the older executives nodded slowly. Another turned to whisper something to his colleague. Mr. Liu smiled, folding his hands on the table. "Would you be willing to help us design the communication process moving forward?" Ivy blinked. "Me? You are the only one," he said, who did not speak over us but stood up for us. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, but her voice held steady. "Yes," she whispered, "I'd be honored." That evening, she stood on the hotel balcony alone, watching the lights of Shanghai shimmer like a dream that, for the first time, was hers. Back in Seattle, George Bennett sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and a smile on his face. He'd seen the news already. His old company had signed a historic new agreement, and the photo at the bottom of the article showed a young woman in a cardigan standing quietly beside 2 CEOs. He didn't need to read her name. He just reached into the drawer beside him, pulled out a fresh piece of notepaper, and began to write. "Dear Ivy, today the world saw what I've known all along, .. Have you ever watched someone walk into a room where no one expects them to belong, only to quietly, gently, change the course of everything? That's exactly what happened next. After that first powerful meeting in Shanghai, Ivy Carter should have been given a brief applause and then shuffled into a back office to let the real professionals take over. But something had shifted subtly but unmistakably. The Chinese executives didn't just see her as a translator anymore. They saw her as a bridge. She was scheduled to return to Seattle the next morning. Instead, they asked her to stay and not just for one more meeting. They invited her to join a 4-week intensive project that involved every layer of negotiation between Skybridge Logistics and the Chinese company, Junli Holdings. She wasn't just translating language, now she was interpreting intent, explaining nuances, offering gentle corrections when tone or context fell off, and slowly, she began to earn something she had never tasted in a boardroom before: influence. But back in Seattle, not everyone was pleased. 3 days into Ivy's extended stay, whispers started rippling across the Skybridge headquarters. Executives, who once barely noticed her, were now combing through emails, trying to figure out how an intern had gained direct access to foreign investors. One manager, red-faced and restless, slammed a folder on a table in frustration. "She's not even full-time staff," he barked. "What are we doing letting her speak for us?" George Bennett, sitting quietly in the corner of the records room, said nothing. He just closed another file and gently smiled to himself, because he already knew the truth. Ivy wasn't speaking for the company. She was speaking to people, and they were listening. Meanwhile, in Shanghai, Ivy was growing. Not louder, not bolder, just truer. Each morning she awoke before sunrise and sat by the window of her hotel room, notebook open, pen in hand. She wrote in Chinese, then translated her thoughts into English, not for business, but for clarity of soul. She was beginning to understand herself better through the lens of a culture so different, yet deeply kind. One evening, after a long negotiation session, Mr. Liu took her aside. "You remind me of my daughter," he said softly. "When she was your age, she also believed that kindness could be strength. Many told her that wasn't enough." He paused, folding his hands. "But she proved them wrong. Just like you are now." Ivy blinked, her throat tightening. "What happened to her?" He looked out at the glowing city. "She's the CFO of our company." They both laughed gently, and for the first time, Ivy didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She felt like someone standing in the center of something, earning her place, not through power or position, but through presence. But there was more coming, something no one had planned for, because halfway through the second week, an unexpected proposal arrived, not from Skybridge, not from Junli, but from a third company, one that had quietly observed Ivy during her meetings, an education tech startup based in Hangzhou that specialized in language, technology, and cultural training. They had read about Ivy's unusual influence on cross-cultural understanding, and they wanted to meet her, not as an intern, not even as a consultant, as a potential partner. At first, she didn't know how to respond. She still wasn't used to people asking for her opinion, let alone her leadership. "I'm not qualified," she whispered into the phone when she called George. That night, his voice came through the line, steady, as always. "Ivy," he said, "the world has more than enough people who are qualified on paper. What it needs are people who are courageous in practice." She didn't say anything, but she didn't hang up either. The next day she met with the education tech founders over tea in a quiet courtyard filled with wind chimes and vines. They spoke in a mix of Mandarin and English, gently asking about her grandmother, her notebook, her views on empathy-based translation. Then they offered her a position on their international advisory board. Part-time, remote, flexible, they said. She could continue working at Skybridge if she wanted to, but they also said something else, something that made her sit very still. "We believe you're not here by accident, Miss Carter. You are exactly the kind of person who can teach the next generation how to listen to each other." That night, Ivy stood at the edge of the Bund, the famous Shanghai promenade, watching ferries glide across the river. She thought about all the nights she had sat beside her grandmother's bed, slowly tracing words in the air. All the mornings she'd entered Skybridge through a side door so she wouldn't draw attention. All the notes George had left on her desk, quietly cheering her on while the world ignored her. She thought about how she had come to China to correct a single sentence, and found an entire chapter waiting for her instead. When she finally walked back to her hotel, she didn't feel shy, she felt ready. Back in Seattle, George opened another email from Shanghai. His eyes filled as he read the update. He picked up his pen and wrote one more note. "Dear Ivy, the world is opening its ears. Because you opened your heart first. Asterisk, what if your whole life, you believed you were meant to stay behind the scenes, to realize the world had quietly been preparing a spotlight just for you?" That was the question swirling in Ivy Carter's mind as the plane touched down again in Seattle. But this time, the terminal didn't feel cold or overwhelming. It felt like a stage waiting for her next act. It had been 21 days in Shanghai, 21 days that unraveled everything she thought she knew about herself. She had gone there as an intern, unnoticed, unheard. Now she was returning as someone whose voice had helped save a $200 million deal, guided tense negotiations with grace, and even attracted offers from companies she never knew existed. But walking back into Skybridge Logistics was a different challenge altogether, because not everyone was ready for the new version of Ivy. She stepped into the lobby with quiet confidence. Her eyes were the same, but there was a subtle difference in how they met the gaze of others, now steady, unflinching. She wore the same soft cardigan she always did, but it was paired with calm assurance instead of self-doubt. The receptionist, Megan, blinked at her. "You're back already?" Ivy smiled. "I am. In the elevator." 2 junior analysts whispered behind her, not realizing she could hear them. That's the intern who flew to China, right? Yeah, they say she led some of the meetings. Can you believe it? Weird, right? She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She'd already learned that being underestimated was its own kind of armor. What mattered wasn't what they said behind her back. It was what she was building in front of them. By the time she reached her desk, there was already an envelope waiting. No handwriting on it this time, just her name in simple print. Ivy Carter. She opened it slowly. Inside was a formal invitation to the upcoming Executive Strategy Summit, Skybridge's highest-level annual event. No interns had ever attended before, until now. Still holding the letter, she looked up to see George Bennett, standing in the doorway of the records room. His warm eyes met hers. They asked for you by name, he said with a small smile. Not bad for someone they didn't even assign a mentor to. She walked to him slowly and handed him the letter. I don't know if I belong there. He held it for a moment, then handed it back. Ivy, he said gently, you belong wherever your voice can make a difference. And right now, that's everywhere. But what neither of them knew, what no one at Skybridge knew, was that the summit wasn't just a strategy review, it was a battlefield. Behind the polished walls of boardrooms and catered luncheons, internal factions were forming. Certain executives were unhappy with the way the Shanghai deal had unfolded. Ivy's role had been seen by some as improvisational, even uncontrolled. One VP in particular, Leonard Voss, had made it his personal mission to bring the company back under disciplined corporate protocol. And to do that, he needed Ivy out of the way. The first strike came the next morning. Ivy received a performance review notice in her inbox, unusual for interns, and especially suspicious considering the timing. The document claimed that she had exceeded her role's boundaries and had potentially exposed the company to risk. She stared at the screen, stunned. It felt like her stomach had dropped through the floor. She had just come back from representing Skybridge on foreign soil, receiving handshakes from CEOs, building human bridges, and now they were questioning her judgment. But instead of hiding, she printed the document and walked straight to HR. I'd like to clarify a few things, she said calmly to the director, and I have emails, meeting notes, and testimonials to support my role. The HR director blinked. Surprised Ivy. This was flagged by executive office. Are you sure you want to challenge it? She didn't flinch. Yes, I'm sure. Over the next 48 hours, Ivy built a quiet case. Not to attack, not to prove she was better, but to show the truth. George helped where he could, sliding her files and notes she might need. And though he didn't say it out loud, he was proud because Ivy wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for every quiet soul who had ever been overlooked, then punished for daring to shine. Then something unexpected happened. An email came in from Mr. Liu in Shanghai. Subject, Ivy Carter. A recommendation. The body of the message was a glowing 3-paragraph endorsement sent directly to the CEO of Sky, praising Ivy's unique ability to foster connection across language and cultural boundaries, and stating in no uncertain terms, we would prefer to continue our business with Skybridge only if Miss Carter remains part of our communication structure. It was more than a letter, it was a lifeline, and it arrived just in time. At the Executive Strategy Summit, Ivy was seated in the far back corner of the conference room, technically allowed, but clearly isolated. Leonard Voss gave the opening remarks, steering the narrative to emphasize discipline, protocol, and chain of command. His subtle jabs at the unofficial delegation to Shanghai weren't lost on anyone. But then, the CEO stood up, and everything changed. He read aloud Mr. Liu's letter, word for word. Then he turned to the crowd. Ivy Carter may have been an intern on paper, but she was a leader in practice. And in my book, leadership is not defined by title, it's defined by trust. He turned, locking eyes with Ivy across the room. And from this moment forward, Miss Carter is no longer an intern. She is the company's newest cross-cultural liaison. The room went silent. For a beat, then a few claps. Then more, until even the executives who once doubted her were on their feet, applauding the girl who had once slipped in through side doors and now stood at the very heart of the room. That night, Ivy didn't celebrate with champagne or confetti. She went home, opened her grandmother's favorite tea, and sat on the floor beside the old photo of them together, her fingers tracing the outline of their hands, frozen mid-sign in a of love and patience. She whispered softly, "We did it, Grandma." And deep in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. Asterisk. There was a strange quiet in the office the next morning, not the kind that comes with calm, but the kind that arrives just before a storm. Ivy Carter walked in with a badge that now read Cross-Cultural Liaison. But more than that, she walked in with a reputation. The whispers were louder this time, not hushed, not judgmental, but filled with curiosity, even admiration. Is that her? She's the one who stood up to Voss, right? She's the reason we still have the Shanghai account. But Ivy wasn't thinking about whispers. She was thinking about what was next. Because she had learned something essential in the last few weeks. Being noticed is only half the battle. The other half is staying true when all eyes are watching. She sat at her new desk, no longer in the intern bullpen, but near the department leads, and began sifting through documents for an upcoming expansion in Seoul. Yet even as she dove into Research and cultural frameworks? Something was off. A message popped up on her screen. Private meeting. CEO's office. Noon. Confidential. No subject. No context. For a moment she stared. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but there was nothing to reply to. When noon came, she took the long hallway up to the executive floor. As she approached the CEO's office, she saw George waiting outside, hands folded, face unusually serious. "Ivy," he said softly, "they've asked for you to join the next global delegation." Her eyes widened. "Already?" "Yes." George nodded. "But there's more." The door opened before he could continue. Inside, the CEO stood by the window, and beside him was someone Ivy hadn't seen before, a poised woman in a sharp navy blazer with a strikingly calm expression. "This," the CEO said, "is Dr. Eliza Monroe. She's a behavioral strategist contracted by several of our international partners. She'll be co-leading with you." Dr. Monroe stepped forward and offered a hand. "I've read everything about your Shanghai success, Ivy, but Seoul will be different, high-context culture, unspoken expectations, and there are whispers of another company trying to undercut us. We're not just walking into negotiations, we're stepping into a very delicate social structure." Ivy nodded. "I understand. I've been preparing." Dr. Monroe didn't smile, but her eyes scanned Ivy with quiet intensity. "I believe you. But understand this trip won't just test your skills, it will test your loyalty, your instinct, and your courage." That afternoon, Ivy received the full itinerary: 4 days in Seoul, 3 dinners with executives, 1 cultural excursion, and a final day of strategic talks. It was all precise and sterile on paper, but her gut told her there was more beneath the surface. As she boarded the flight 2 days later, her seatmate, a Korean-American translator named Jisoo, whispered something as the plane took off. "You know they picked you because they think you're good at catching things others miss." Ivy glanced over, confused. "What do you mean?" Jisoo opened her tablet and scrolled through a news article. It was about a South Korean shipping firm, once family-owned, now teetering on collapse. But suddenly, saved by a mysterious investor rumored to have ties to a rival of Skybridge. "They're trying to push you into a cultural blind spot," Jisoo said. "They think you'll fail not because you're not smart, but because you're kind. They think kindness is weakness." Ivy's jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time someone mistook gentleness for fragility, but it might be the last. By the second night in Seoul, Ivy had picked up subtle signs. The way one executive always looked at his associate before answering, the soft pauses when she mentioned certain delivery routes, the quick deflection whenever pricing structures were brought up. Something was being hidden. And it wasn't just cultural modesty. After the third dinner, she pulled Dr. Monroe aside. "They're being too agreeable," Ivy whispered, "but only on surface-level topics. When it comes to long-term vision, they avoid eye contact. I think they're prepping for a silent switch to another logistics partner after this deal." Dr. Monroe watched her carefully, then said, "Then we test them." The next morning, Ivy led the discussion, but she did something unexpected. She paused midway through and asked if they could review the transportation blueprint backwards, from delivery and working in reverse to dispatch. It was a method her grandmother once used when teaching her to recheck documents for accuracy. At first, the executives were confused, but within 5 minutes, a discrepancy emerged. One of the proposed routes didn't exist. They had fabricated it. The room felt tense. Ivy leaned forward gently. "I don't need perfection," she said softly, "but I do need honesty." There was a pause. Then the senior Korean executive, Mr. Kim, slowly lowered his eyes and gave a slight nod. His tone was respectful. "You noticed what many wouldn't. That means you may be someone we can trust." By the time the deal closed, not only had Ivy saved the Seoul negotiations, she'd forged a stronger partnership than Skybridge had in the last 5 years. She even convinced them to add an education clause committing the firm to donate a portion of profits to local language and cultural schools in both Korea and the US. WHEN. She returned home. She didn't find praise waiting for her in loud applause. Instead, there was something better. A simple message from Mr. Kim, sent after her departure: "True strength hides in gentle hands, and we saw yours." That night, Ivy sat on her fire escape with a cup of tea and a quiet heart. She didn't need the world to shout her name, because now she understood. Real change doesn't come from the loudest person in the room. It comes from the one who listens, hardest, then speaks with purpose. The world had shifted beneath her feet subtly, but unmistakably. Just weeks ago, Ivy Carter had been a shy intern who memorized sign language in quiet corners for a grandmother most people never met. Now, she sat at the center of a boardroom that had once ignored her entirely. Only this time, they were listening, truly listening. But this wasn't the end of her story. It wasn't even the peak. It was the moment the real test began. Because success, she was learning, comes with its own kind of danger. The kind that doesn't shout, but whispers. The kind that doesn't slam doors, but opens to many, inviting you to choose the one that pulls you farthest from who you are. That Monday morning, Ivy walked into Skybridge HQ and was greeted not with applause, but a single sealed envelope. No name on the outside. just the company's embossed crest and the smell of old paper. She opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter from the board chair. Miss Carter, we've watched your rise with interest. The sole agreement has exceeded expectations. We believe you are ready for a greater role, one that comes with global responsibility, a private residence, and executive authority. However, we must inform you, if you accept, you will be placed under an exclusive contract, which limits all external contact with competitors, educational institutions, or advisory boards. In short, you may no longer remain unclaimed. She stared at the words, reading them again and again. Executive authority, a dream, but unclaimed. That single word crawled under her skin like frost. All her life, Ivy had been invisible. Now, when the world finally noticed, it wanted to brand her, contain her, claim her. It was flattering and terrifying. She folded the letter, placed it in her drawer, and walked to the roof. The same spot she used to sneak to when she was just an intern eating sandwiches in silence. She stood there now, high above the city, watching the sun split through the glass buildings. Her heart beat slower, steadier. Then, she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She pulled out her grandmother's old bracelet from her pocket, just a plain silver chain, with a small charm shaped like two hands, signing the word love. It reminded her why she ever started all this. That evening, Ivy met George in the archives. He had heard the news, of course. The letter had reached every level of the company like wildfire. He didn't ask her what she would decide. He only said this: do not mistake their offer for their belief in your purpose. Remember, your power came from choosing to be yourself, even when no one clapped. For it that night, Ivy sent one email, not to the board, not to her colleagues, to a girl named Aiko, a translator she met in Seoul. Aiko had once told her about a tiny startup in Tokyo that was building a platform to connect deaf professionals to global corporations. They were struggling, no investors, no outreach, no chance, really. But Ivy saw something in their mission that mirrored her own journey: quiet vision, underserved voices, unseen brilliance. She offered to help them, not as a CEO, not as a corporate liaison, but as Ivy Carter, girl who learned to listen when no one else did. The next morning, when the board called her into a meeting expecting a signed contract, she walked in with a different kind of power. Calm, unshaken, unafraid. She placed the unsigned offer on the table and said simply, "You were right. I'm ready for more, just not at the cost of who I am." The room fell silent. The youngest intern in company history had just turned down a private residence and a six-figure salary, with less hesitation than most people show ordering coffee. And yet not a single person doubted her. Because they knew she wasn't walking away from greatness. She was choosing the kind that lasts. 1 month later, Ivy boarded a plane not to Shanghai, not to Seoul, but to a tiny co-working space in Tokyo where the walls were filled with sticky notes, drawings, and handwritten phrases in both kanji and American Sign Language. They didn't roll out a red carpet when she arrived. No flowers, no fanfare. Just a group of young dreamers trying to bridge languages, industries, and hearts. She belonged. And for the first time, she felt it. Years later, when Skybridge won a Global Peace and Trade Award, their founding story included not just boardrooms and mergers, but the girl who rewrote their narrative by refusing to lose herself in the noise. The girl who built a future not on contracts, but connection. And if you were to visit that tiny startup in Tokyo today, you'd find a small framed note hanging near the door. Handwritten. No logo. It reads, "The quietest voice in the room changed everything, not by speaking louder, but by listening deeper. Ivy Carter."